thanks everybody for coming to today's event. And I'm very happy to be here and to help my colleague and also try to help students, intellectually active in the middle of the summer. And so we have about maybe 5 weeks before you come back to campus. So I think we really hope to see you in person on campus, in the fall semester. But as the pandemic goes on, and probably the universe has a different plan for us. But I think the today is we try to there's several reasons why I want to do the talk, for today. And one is, of course, I just mentioned, so it's a good event put together by the Chinese program at the Department of East Asian Language and Cultures. And also it's an event co-sponsored by the China Forum. And also this is a good advertisement for my own class. I'm teaching U.S.-China relations in the fall semester. So maybe some of you are registered, some of you are registered for my class this fall. And so this gives you a little bit taste and what the class is about and how we conduct our lectures. So without further ado, let me get into the content of today's talk. So there's a reason why well, maybe I introduce myself first. My name is Zhao Ma, or in Chinese Ma Zhao, and I'm associate professor of modern Chinese history and cultures in ELC department, and I'm a historian by training, and I teach modern Chinese urban history, social history, and also the history of U.S.-China relations. And so in many ways, my research and my teaching, we have like the interests converged, in one place, which is the Korean War. And because for me, it's interesting place to see. On the one hand, we can see the development of a Chinese revolutionary foreign policy in the early 1950s, and also we will see this kind of a set of pattern of U.S.-China confrontations or U.S.-China interactions for almost 20 years. And so, and also today, we will see, if you look at all the parties involved in the Korean War, and, North Korea remained China's treaty ally to this very day. And also, we are unfortunately, or maybe luckily, luckily in a sense, is we are seeing a U.S.-China confrontation today. And so it's good on the academic, angle. So you will see how two countries engaged in really difficult, time periods, and how they escalate the tension, and how they maybe de-escalate tensions if they have enough wisdom. And so so that's the why I'm interested in the Korean War. And maybe for this particular year, this is 2020, and which is also the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. And so normally for historians, we like anniversaries. We like to celebrate anniversaries. So this is a good time to think about what happened 70 years ago, and then to see what we can learn from a war 70 years ago, and can we avoid a war down the road in the future, or how do we manage crisis, especially when the bilateral relationship between China and the United States is getting worse by day. And so that's sort of some kind of general pictures we have. And now let me get into the war itself. So, well, and also maybe one quick note is because this is a combined Chinese and English program. So for the presentation itself, I'm going to do this in English. But when you look at the PowerPoint, so you will see some sort of Chinese over there. And so for students who come to this talk from my class or from China Forum, don't worry, in my class it's going to be all in English, right? And so, but here, because we do have students from Chinese programs, so we do want to give them the opportunities to exercise their Chinese. So that's the, but also they can tell you the importance of like the bilingual knowledge. So you can not just listen to the history, from my perspective, but also you can read the history, right, through the language used by people who were involved in the process of history. Okay, so now let's get into the war itself. So a very basic timeline to begin with. And maybe well, this is another interesting part. There's many ways to study the Korean War. And normally in this country, we do have people study the political history, study the diplomatic history, and study the military history of the Korean War. And for me, especially at this moment in history, so we can see it really tells us something about the U.S.-China relations through the angle of crisis management. Right? This year is also this is the 21st anniversary. Sorry, this is the 41st anniversary of the normalization of the U.S. and PRC relationship, People's Republic of China. Okay, so two countries normalized this relationship in 1979. So from 1979 onward, all the way to today, normally we see it is the relationship between two countries. They follow an upward trajectory. It means getting better and better. Right? And so, give you one example. So when Richard Nixon visited China, in 1972, the U.S.-China bilateral trade, okay, that was $96 million a year in 1972, and today is $1.5 billion a day. So that would tell you, just from the simple economic side, you will see how intense this relationship has grown over the past 40 years. Right? And normally it goes through this kind of upward trajectory. But including today, we began to see, actually, this is also a relationship going through many crises. And for example, here's the poster. It tells you this is a Korean War poster. So we see here's a powerful, stronger China and North Koreans working together, hand in hand, shoulder by shoulder, and to kick the American ass. And so that's sort of one of the major crises in the U.S.-China relations. But it's not the third, but it is certainly not the first one, or not the last one. So here we go. And so can anybody read this poster? Emma, I'm counting on you. Just read this part right here.
我们一定要交防台湾。
Okay, translate, please.
We need to. I'm not sure what 交防 is, but something to do with Taiwan. So.
All right. So 解放 means liberate. So which means we will certainly liberate Taiwan. So this is another crisis in this bilateral relationship when China, PRC shell Taiwan Island, not the main island, but the Jinmen Island, and create a cross-strait crisis in 1958. So okay, you can keep going. See it. This is another major crisis in the bilateral relationship. Anybody has any idea what this crisis is about? I give you $1. I'm not able to see everybody, so let's say just unmute yourself and tell us what this crisis is about.
The 1989 student protest in Tiananmen.
Perfect. So this is a 1989 Tiananmen demonstration, right? And so the Chinese government cracked down on the protesters, and so that creates this international outcry for this abuse or blatant violation of human rights. Okay, so that's again, it's a crisis. And how about this one here? How about this one? So can anybody read the characters right here? Or anybody can guess when this happened and what this is about. This is in 1999, when there's the Yugoslavia Civil War, right? And so the NATO and the United States, they accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in Yugoslavia. Okay? And so that triggered the outcry inside of China. So because I mean the Chinese diplomatic compounds were bombed by the U.S. and the NATO force. So it triggered almost like a 2 weeks and 3 weeks of a national protest. So that's another crisis. So and how about this one? How about this one? Any idea what this crisis is about?
COVID.
Right, it's today, right? It is today, and it is well today. Well, actually, is much more complex for today, and you will see this in U.S. and China clashes at multiple fronts today, and so you have both the coronavirus and also the trade war, and the TikTok, right? And if you watched the news yesterday, and Donald Trump decided to he expressed the plan, right, to ban the TikTok. And there's just all kinds of things going on today. And so in the sense is, if we look at the whole, the whole trajectory, right? So you will see on the one hand, yes, we recognize it is a growing relationship between two powerful countries. And at the same time, this bilateral relationship is really seriously, I mean, it went through a series of crises. So today's talk, we want to pick up the example of the Korean War as a way to understand, how two countries, how they deal with this crisis, okay? And how they sort of manage this crisis, and how they avoid crisis. If we can learn something from the history, what can we learn? And how can we apply what we learned in the history to maybe today? Well, you and I, neither you nor I are in a position to make any policy decisions. But I think hopefully, because Washi claimed that we're going to grow the next generation of leaders. So I hope many of you will become leaders in different capacities. So now you know how to manage a crisis. And then when one day you are in a leadership position, so you will help us go through the crisis moments. Okay, so that's the angle for today, is the crisis management for this relationship. All right, and now let's talk about the Korean War and its historical significance. There's many ways to see. Very quickly is about the chronology of this Korean War, and so we see here's a map of the Korean Peninsula. So the war started, on the night of June 25th, 1950. So the North Korea invaded South Korea and trying to unify the Korean Peninsula by force. And then the line tells you the solid red line. It shows where the North Korean armies were able to push. Right? So it was able very much, the entire Korean Peninsula until September 15th, 1950. So the U.S. landed in Incheon and kind of dealt a deadly blow to the North Korean offense. And so here the solid blue line indicates where the US-led United Nations force, they were able to push the boundary of the fighting. So you can tell they were very successful. They pushed the boundary all the way to the China-North Korean border, right, in the Manchuria or the northeast China. And so the broken red line, that indicate is the Chinese volunteer army. So China, on October 19th, China sent millions of soldiers across the Yalu River into North Korea and to rescue the crumbling North Korean regime. And so after 4 major offenses from the winter of 1950 to the spring of 1951, so China was able to push the front line back to the 38 parallels, which is in many ways is pretty phenomenal. You see the repressive development. As a China, if you look at the army was ill-equipped, is ill-prepared, right, and also is just overcoming all kinds of logistical challenges, and was able to stand toe to toe with the most powerful country in the world at the time, it's the United States. So, which is a kind of a very impressive accomplishment in itself. And then okay, China entered the conflict in October 1950, and then in the following 2 years, in 7 months, China committed to 1.5 million soldiers to the combat. And among them, at least, the most conservative estimate is that 180,000 Chinese soldiers were killed in action. If you put in the wounded, missing in combat, and the POW, and altogether the Chinese casualty is well over 250,000. So and then after 5 major offensives, and so eventually the whole conflict got down to a stalemate along the 38 parallels. And then for years, both parties tried to talk and try to negotiate. So eventually, an armistice was signed on July 17th, 1951. So that's kind of the basic chronology of this war. And we see when people, measure, or when people trying to understand the significance of this war. Okay, so China, if you think about Chinese history, well, China has been through many wars in the early 20th century. Right? And so this is not only a war. If you think about the number of casualty, right? I mean, yes, I just mentioned to you, there's 250,000 Chinese soldiers, right, were killed, wounded, right, and missing in combat and taken prisoners in the war. If you look at the casualty, which is actually in comparison with other major wars China fought over the first half of 20th century, it's not that kind of, super huge, right? And so given a few numbers, for example, just the Second Sino-Japanese War, China lost 35 million lives, right? And then if you think about the Chinese Civil War in the late 40s, China lost 2 million soldiers. And if you think about the major political movements in Mao's China, in the second half of the 20th century, so China lost 2 million, 2 million people were executed in the land reform, right? And also at least, somewhere between at least 2 million people died in the Cultural Revolution, right? And also historians put, somewhere between the 14 to 45 million people perished in the Great Chinese Famine in the early 60s. So if you just look at the number, it doesn't mean this is such a significant historical event. But there are other ways to understand the significance of the Korean War in Chinese history and in the history of this region. So we can see here. All right. So these are other things we can say what happened in this war, and so maybe anybody can read it. Emma, I'm counting on you again.
So the first time that a war was sort of directed outward, out of the country, I suppose. The first time of like globalism in terms of war. The first time of like hot war, 热战, I guess.
Okay, hot war, yes.
And then the first time of like 想 sort of similar.
Imagined war.
Imagine.
All right. So let me go through this, the other ways to understand the significance of this war. First of all, this is the first foreign war the PRC China fought. Right? I mean, PRC was founded in 1949, and so this is a war fought on a foreign soil in the Korean Peninsula, hundreds and thousands of miles away from China's homeland. Right? So this is the first foreign war for PRC. And also, the term right here is 国际主义. Okay, it means internationalism. This is a international communism. So China fought this war not for its own, interest, not only for its own interest. Right? So this is a way China trying to affirm its membership in the international communist movement. Okay, so there's a huge amount of ideological push and drive behind this war. And when we say 热战, okay, hot war, what is a hot war? This is the first hot war in the Cold War. We all know Cold War, right? So this is, U.S. and the Soviet Union and standoff, that lasted from 40, 45, 46, all the way to the end of the Soviet Empire. Okay? So, but in comparison with World War I, World War II, in the Cold War, and there's no necessarily military confrontations between two superpowers, right? Or military clashes between two superpowers. Right? Instead, it's more a propaganda war. It's more a proxy war. Okay? And by proxy war, it means the allies, they fight, but not necessarily the superpowers themselves fight against each other. So, but this is the first hot war, right? And so we do see the geopolitics playing a role in getting people in the conflict, right? But also we see it's the major powers, especially Soviet Union, right, and stayed out of the conflict. And maybe the fourth one, the last one, the first imagined war, right? Imagined war. This is something I also want to emphasize because the the war was fought on a foreign land and far away from China's capital city or the big part of China, right? I mean, if you look at the map right here, you will see Manchuria, over here. But if you think about Tibet, or think about Southwest China or Southeast China, right? Or even the China's mainland. Okay? So it's not that kind of close, which means when people, let's say, just say in Beijing, okay, the way they understand the war, it's not through TikTok, right? It's not through Twitter, right? It's not through Facebook. It is not through CNN or CCTV, right? It is through the propaganda system. Right? And so the propaganda system has served as a filter and it filters through all the informations and sending over to China. Okay, and so people get some pictures of the war, but not the complete picture of this war. But in that sense, it's very much I'm calling this a imagined war. Right? So you imagine how glorious the war fighting has become, right? And you imagine what sort of the geopolitical reasons mobilize us into this war, and you imagine the consequence of this war. Right? You imagine the glory of this war. Okay? And so all through these propaganda systems, which can lead to my current book project. We're trying to see what sort of information were circulated, at this moment, in the moment of a Korean War. Right? And we'll see the different voices, between the official voice, which is the propaganda, right, to tell you what the definition of this war from the government perspective. But at the same time, you can also see how people talk about this war. Right? So you see this official voice and clashes with unofficial voices. So altogether, it create, just even turn the whole country into a marketplace of information. So which somehow, give us another legacy of this war. The war is how Chinese government built a political communication system in China to ensure that people from now on, they will get information from the government sources. So that information system not only just work and operate in a wartime situation, and that this vertical communication system also works for other political campaigns, even to this very day. So that's kind of another legacy of this war. So that's kind of how we, there's always the way to measure the political, military and foreign policy significance. And also there are some other ways, particularly, we can use to see this war. And for today, because our focus is crisis management. So I'm going to introduce you four lenses, okay, how to study crisis management, okay, or how to manage crisis. Right? And so those four lenses, let's start with this. So these are, I call them four eyes, okay, four eyes. So one is, we study the crisis management through interest, particularly the national pragmatic interest. The second lens is through the ideology. And what is the ideological pursuit behind the calculation of a crisis? behind the deliberation of the crisis system and the stake in the crisis. And also the third I is institution. So we talk about how different institutions inside and outside of the government, what role they play, either to escalate the tension or de-escalate the tension. And finally, it's individual. At this moment, given the time we have, we won't be able to get into the bigger Chinese population, 1.4 billion or 800 million in 1950s. So we put, we look at particularly, we have a particular interest in the individual leaders. Okay, so we see what role played by individual leaders, right, when they decide either to enter the conflict or get out of the conflict. Okay. So let's start with the four I's, okay, one after the other. So the first I, interest. So you will see, for China, the reason why they decide to get into the conflict, okay, because they see a serious problems, okay, and so they see the military development, okay, they see especially the U.S. invasion of North Korea after the Incheon landing, okay, they see this is a serious challenge of China's national interest. Okay. By national interest, basically two things. Okay. One is regime survival. Number two, economic security. Okay. By regime survival, it means what? Just look at the map right here. See, when we talk about Korean Peninsula, it's geographically very important because the Korean Peninsula is in, we call them as at the crossroads of empires. Yeah, at the crossroads of empires. So you will see to the north of Korean Peninsula, which country? To the north of Korean Peninsula, which country?
China.
Before get to China, another country.
Russia?
Russia, yes. Okay, you can see the Russian Empire up north, right? And to the west of Korean Peninsula, which country? This time it's China, right? And then to the east, which country? It's Japan, right? And then where's the United States? Where is the United States? We are all over the places, right? The United States, we have a global interest. We have a global security. So that's why we are everywhere, okay? So you will see when we say at the crossroads of empire, so especially for China, Korean Peninsula served as a strategic buffer zone, right? Separating China from other major powers in the neighborhood. So here is, you can see when United States, especially this is 1950, right? So this is already the moment when China, this is PRC China, right? A communist China. And then there's the leader of the free world as the United States. So already in a very serious confrontations. So China just cannot afford to have its neighboring country be controlled by the United States. Right? So that is just simply for a strategic political reason over there. And also, if you look at this is very part of China, right? And sharing border with North Korea, which is the Manchuria, okay, the Manchuria. And so which is by mid-19th century, the mid-20th century, this was the industrial homeland. This is the industrial base for the whole PRC China, right? In part because of the Japan's colonial rule over there for half a century, and also in part because this is closer to Soviet Union. So China got a lot of assistance from Soviet Union to set up factories in this whole Manchuria region. So you just cannot let your enemy or your rivals, right, and have the troops right across the border from the most important part of your economic development. So that's why we say for the regime survival, for economic securities, and also don't forget. Look at this map. Look at this map right here. It's on the same day the United States declare, the U.S. will involve in the conflict and will push the North back to where it was. Though the U.S. also sent Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Strait. And so that is another kind of a big challenge for China, right? To think about, Taiwan's part of, for in the PRC's political discourse, Taiwan is also part of PRC China. So that's why we see so if you look at the interest, this is the reasons, right? And for China to involve itself in this conflict, despite China was the PRC was founded just barely a year ago, right? And just China was out of the civil war, and just a year ago. So that's sort of, if you look at the whole crisis moment. So this is how China calculate the political or the security stake, and at this moment. And so here we go. All right, maybe we'll go here. The second I we have, it's ideology. And so these are a few, key terms we have to talk about ideology. Here we go. It's they call 一边倒, right? 一边倒 means by ideology, it very much means well, the geopolitical confrontation and also which side China stood with, okay? And then how that kind of a geopolitical as well as ideological position China held at the time decide, what China will do or what China decide to do, in this moment of crisis. Okay? So at one point, we will see it to talk about the ideology. So here give you a few kind of principles of Chinese foreign policy at the time. Well, they talk about the first one is 一边倒. By 一边倒, it means how you just look at these two guys, right? And so here's Chairman Mao, this is Joseph Stalin. Okay? And so the revolutionary China's policy, foreign policy, is to go with Soviet Union, to be part of the Soviet international communist system. And also, maybe the most important part is this one right here. It called, what is this? They call 中间地带, right? Or intermediate zone. By intermediate zone, it means what? It means the sort of a vast area, okay, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so this vast area, China calls this, it's not directly United States or directly inside of Soviet Union, but the areas besides, outside of these two countries. Okay, so these are the area you will see a lot of countries, and they gained their independence right after World War II. Okay? And in many of these countries, especially in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, think about the countries like Cuba, the countries like Korea, the countries like Vietnam. Right? So these countries, they gained their independence. So for Mao, the idea is, well, it's these countries get their independence, okay, and then they're going to develop. They're going to decide how they develop their own countries. Right? So they have two choices. One choice is communism. One choice is capitalism, right? So if more countries go with communism, that's going to be the defeat of capitalism, right? And vice versa. So if the more countries go with capitalism, that's going to be a serious setback for communism. Right? So Mao's belief is now the future of the world really depends on what happened in this intermediate zone. Right? And so China's role, for Mao, he believed, the China's role or China's contribution to international communism is precisely to export Chinese revolutionary model. So because look at China, we are sort of a country, bullied by this imperialistic powers, right? And we are a country from agricultural economy to industrial economy, right? We are a country, and sort of we go through this armed struggle and then build this beautiful People's Republic of China. So if we can do this in our own country, so certainly you guys can do this in your country. Right? So that's why the Chinese model, the Chinese revolutionary communist revolutionary model certainly apply to other countries as well. So that's why Mao decided. So this is the reason why China has its moment in this mid 20th century. Right? The moment is China can lead this whole intermediate zone, right? And to get it to the part of the international communist movement, and then to create this crucial momentum for the development of global communist movement. So that's kind of the ideological reasons behind Mao's calculations, why China should involve itself into this whole conflict. And maybe, let's say, okay. So now we talk about institutions, okay, institutions. So now you can, from the two previous slides, you will see, for the interest and then for ideology. Okay? And so that's for China to decide to escalate the crisis and then to get into the crisis. Institutions as well here, institutions. And can anybody read this paragraph? Laura, you want to try?
I can always do it if you need me to, but yeah.
Well,
So
so maybe in the interest of time, we just quickly go over this part. It's when we talk about institution, okay, that means government is a massive machine. So you have bureaucracies, you have institutional agendas and interests. This is a massive machine. And then for government to make a decision, it involved, this is a complex operation, it involved negotiation, prioritization, synchronization, okay, and then execution of your plan. Okay, so this is a very complex system. And so for the system to work, so you will see it, there's always different voices, different interests, right? And just like, maybe in this country, sometimes, the State Department, right, they want to exercise diplomacy, but maybe for Pentagon, right, it's more a military approach. And then for Commerce Department, it's more about the money, right? And so you have just multiple different type of interests. So sometimes those institutions, they can work with each other, and sometimes they create, barriers or tensions, okay? And maybe that will stop government from coming up with a coherent and consistent policies, right? So that's sort of what the institution is about, okay? And so in China as well, this is a field marshal, Nie Rongzhen, recall the decision-making process of this war. Basically he's talking about, at the time, China, just in China, you have the civil bureaucracy, you have the party apparatus and the military leadership. They have different agreement. Well, they disagree with each other in terms of when to intervene and when to fight this war. But altogether, we see people, they in Chinese cases, the different institutions were able to come down to a decision. Right? And once that decision comes up, we're going to talk about who made that decision ultimately. But we can say when the decision was made, because of for the ideological reasons, for the national interest, to fight a war is needed, right? So this whole government was able to function as a well-oiled machine and to carry out this war-fighting effort, right, in a very impressive way. Okay? And so it very much ends all the policy debate, and it kind of realigned the different priorities, okay? And so it produced a clear and coherent policy, and it translated those policies into the top-down propaganda campaign on the home front. And so this doesn't mean the campaign machine silenced all the oppositional views, or the campaign never had missteps or setbacks. Okay? And so, but we do see those national interests and ideological pursuit, they combine and produce a quite powerful message. This is how China called this war. Just in 8 characters, right? They call this war 抗美援朝 and 保家卫国. It means to resist America, aid Korea, protect the family, and defend the homeland. And so that, and also forever, this was written into Chinese vocabulary, right? And like Qin Laoshi points out in the beginning of today's talk. So this is how, this war was defined and remembered by the Chinese in mainland China. Right? And so you can tell, but that's just this 8 characters and this phrase, it tells you, how sort of this whole governmental institutional machine was able to work with each other, right, and to come to this movement. And finally, let's see. Maybe I'll go here. So, all right. So finally, it is about individual, right? And this time is more about one individual, which is Chairman Mao. Okay? So Mao provided a tough and vigorous leadership, right? And so for his own belief that a weaker and smaller China, the Chinese army, can fight against a powerful, stronger U.S. army, right? And so in part because it's kind of Mao's own revolution experience, right? Because if you look at the whole military and political career of Chairman Mao, and he's always been fighting with powerful enemies, right? And could be the Nationalist Party, could be Japan, at this time it's the United States. Right? So he fundamentally believed that this whole notion of a people's war, right? This whole notion of one country united together, and then to overpower your enemy, your opponent. Right? And he believed in this, and so he was able to make that kind of the ultimate decision to get China into this war, and then to really decide the whole kind of the timeline and the key decision-making process over the course of this war fighting. Okay, and so let's say. So that's the reason why, I really encourage you, whenever you see a crisis, right? And so try to use the 4 lenses we have, right? To think about how to understand, the process of this crisis and the management of crisis, right? And the important parties in the decision making over the course of this crisis, from interest to ideology, to institutions and to individuals. Okay? And so if we have, if we look at the whole Korean War through these 4 lenses, right? And if we try to draw some lessons from this crisis management in mid-20th century crisis, okay? And so these are some lessons I think we can learn from this mid-20th century crisis. So here is, you see the crisis, especially in the context of China, right? The crisis, or the political leaders see the crisis, okay, particularly at the moment when they see a threat to the regime security and a territorial integrity. Okay, so again, it's going to be both, right? So the interest part and also the ideology part. So so they will, they definitely trigger this alarm, okay, when they see a regime security and territorial integrity are challenged, okay, by an external enemy. And then crisis will escalate. And when individual leadership is not check and balance by institutions. And this is precisely what happened in the Korean crisis. So in both countries, to a certain extent. In the U.S., it's more about the Douglas MacArthur, and threatening to use the nuclear weapons against China and North Korea, and really can step out of the bound of Truman administration's policy. in China here is, well, we do see institutional sort of resistance to a certain extent, okay? But eventually it's Mao himself made that decision and called the final call. Right? And finally is the crisis deepened, okay, when this ideological idealism suppresses the pragmatic interest. Okay? And so here we see the what happened in the Korean War is eventually it's more about just defending China's national interest, right? The border, the regime, right? Because by 1953, we don't, the China was very clear that the United States has no intention to attack mainland China. But why this crisis continues, right? And this kind of confrontation continues for the next 22 years. It's because the China has this ideological interest, right? The ideological interest is global revolution. And so well, I mean, in many ways, we see the reason why I say Korean War set the pattern of the U.S.-China confrontation for almost 30 years. It's precisely because we see this, right? We see this on the slide here. And also we say, if you look at 1979, right? So when US and China decided to end decade-long confrontation, right? To come back and work together, right? To have a normal relationship, it's precisely because all the crisis elements, you can see from this slide are gone by 1979, right? Think about the first one, regime security, territorial integrity. By 1979, the U.S. made it very clear, U.S. has no interest in taking over Chinese territories, right? And instead, it's the Soviet Union posing an existential threat to China, right? So that's why, there's no more concern over regime security or territorial integrity, okay? Or the concern come from another country, not the United States. And also in 1979, well, Mao died already. So instead, we began to see a new generation of leaders, right? But this time it's more collective leadership, not a single, just power strongman leadership. And finally, the 1979, China started economic reform, right? And a key signature development of Chinese economic reform is to build economy, right? To integrate China in the global market system, right? It's no longer about global revolutions. Right? So that tells you, when you have all of this concerns at the same time in mid 20th century, so we see a crisis easily escalated into a war. So when you have all these things gone, and by pretty much the end of 1970s, so we see two countries and they were able to work with each other and to have a normal relationship. So maybe today is another interesting moment in the U.S.-China relationship. So I mean, I don't know how many of you follow Mike Pompeo's speech at Nixon Library, Presidential Library, about a week ago. How many of you watched the? Okay, Lori, give me a one sentence what this speech is about.
I think the speech is about an escalation of crisis amid the U.S.-China relationship, and I think things are getting pretty bad.
Okay, and also it's not just pretty bad, right? I mean, you can tell when Mike Pompeo talk about China, and he is definitely talking about the ideological challenge posed by the Chinese system, right? So it's not just about China, it's particularly the Chinese Communist Party, right? And he just keep using the word the Chinese Communist Party, right? And so then China become a revisionist country, and China become a strategic threat, right? China become an ideological rival. So we see, again, this is very dangerous. So we see the sort of, this ideological something, coming back to this whole, calculation of this bilateral relationship. Right? And also we see the problem in both in China and in the United States. Right? We see some kind of, well, definitely in China, you see the strongmanship. right? And so Xi Jinping is definitely a powerful leader. Okay, and how many institutions can provide a check and balance, right, for Xi Jinping himself? This is up in the air. It's a big question. We don't know. And so I mean, so that's why it's well, you know, if you want to know more about the this other part of U.S.-China relationship, okay, especially other crisis, you know, in the relationship, from the Taiwan to the Tiananmen demonstration, and then to the sort of the trade war today. Okay, well, you are welcome to my class in fall. And so I will just leave it over here. And so maybe we can have in a few minutes and for questions. Thank you.